Cool. I might kick off if you guys are okay. So I'll give you guys a brief update of what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks. So we've got today, which is basically everything after you figured out product market fit, what happens after that. And it'll be a lot of different YouTube videos, and we can just discuss what's covered, more than sort of me just ramming information down your throats. Next week, we've got a guest lecturer. I've got a guest lecturer coming, a guy called Thomas, who's one of the visiting entrepreneurs at Victoria University. And he was previously part of Startup Victoria, so he's quite connected in the startup scene in Australia. And he started a couple of startups, so he'll come in and just talk to you about his methodology, what he's learned, and just give you some advice and potential networking opportunities as well. And then the following week is generally I just leave it as a workshop week. So because you'll have your final assignment due essentially at the end of that week. And we can do it one of two ways. Like we can come in here, so I can actually come in physically to class, or if you guys would prefer, and we could just do it like sort of almost as a group. Or if you prefer, you can hit me up and have like one-on-one sessions through the week, or at a time that's more convenient for you. It doesn't have to go for 2 hours. It can be like I check in 20 minutes, half hour. It can be longer if you want. That also works for the off-campus students as well. It's sort of up to you guys. Maybe we'll decide at the end of the seminar today whether you can stand to be in a room with me for 2 hours again or not. Cool. So what we're going to cover today essentially is what comes next. So there's scaling and growing a company, building a team, acquiring funding, and dealing with investors, and the detail, and some of the dispelling some of the mysticism behind some of those things. So really relatively straightforward. So essentially, what comes next? Up to now, you guys have been pretty consistently working on the same idea for a while. So you should have a fair idea of the product market fit by now, like how much of a fit you've got. Essentially, once you have product market fit, the next thing to do is go to market, actually take it to market, and that's when scale happens, and you need people, and you need capital, and you need resources, and all that sort of stuff. That's really when you're scaling a media company. And I'll go through, at the end of this, I'll go through examples of companies that we all know about, and we can see the journey of scale that they've gone through from funding rounds. And essentially, what you're looking for, or the challenge in that phase of a startup is not finding out if people love my product, and love what I'm doing, is can I find a scalable sales and marketing to product fit? So you might have a small niche audience that really loves what you do, but can you grow that in a sustainable and profitable way? So all of these things you can build on from here. Like if you've got an idea of those things, like an idea of your market and the traction that you have within it, the idea of your product suitability and an MVP, and then views on the cost and revenue model of your business, then you're sort of ready to take that next step into scale. Okay. And that's effectively split across these 4 areas that I mentioned, with the exception of culture. We can talk a little bit about culture, and there's a few different arguments about what culture stands for and what it doesn't in the context of company building. But a lot of people say, all right, you've been building a product, and it might just be you and your mates in a room for a while. And if you get to a point where it's successful enough, you stop building a product and you start building a company, which is a different thing entirely. But a lot of people basically say, like a lot of entrepreneurs will get to that point and they won't make the transition, and then they might fail, or they might get forced out by their investors because they can't make the transition to stop thinking about building a product and start thinking about building a company and a business. So scaling and growth, what does that actually mean? Essentially, it's the jump between searching for a business model and then executing on the business model. And the things that you need to do across those 2 different tasks are very different. So when you're searching for a business model in that Steve Blank methodology, at the start where he says real startup innovation is a search, and a startup is a temporary organization because it exists to find product market fit, and then it transitions into a normal company, which is about optimization and process. So at the start, it's a very creative process, inquisitive, you're trying to figure out things. And then once you've figured out the business model, you step into this rigorous kind of machine-like phase where you're trying to build an engine around this value proposition you've built. So essentially, if you think about it in the context of the business model canvas, it's good. Everything around product market fit is really figuring out the value proposition and your customer segments, and then the connections between those two, which are your relationships and your channels. That's basically just you figuring out product market fit. Building a company is everything else around that. This guy, the COO of Square, probably has a really good overview of those differences. We'll watch a little bit of this. We won't watch a lot of it, but you can round up and watch the rest in your own time. If you guys haven't, have you guys heard of Square? So Jack Dorsey, who was one of the co-founders of Twitter, is this crazy serial entrepreneur. So he founded Twitter. I think he worked at Google prior to that, with the founder of Instagram. Then he went off and founded Twitter. After that, he founded a mobile kind of payments company. And it's this tiny little Square device, and you plug it into your phone, and it means that you can take credit card payments. So it's a whole payment kind of ecosystem and platform. If you've ever caught an Uber and they ask you, do you just want to pay me instead? A lot of them will have Square as well, and they'll just turn the app off and then just take a payment from like an individual. So, but if you go to a market, like lots of people are selling like clothes at a secondhand market will have one. You buy them from the Apple store for about $100, and you can just plug it in and take payments. It's pretty cool. So he founded Square, and this guy works for him at Square. He was the COO, essentially the guy who ran the operations side of the business to take it from being like a crazy little awesome startup into a multi-billion-dollar e-commerce payments company, which is pretty serious.
And I would assume that you've already sort of hired a bunch of relentlessly resourceful people, that you built a product that at least some people love, that you probably raised some capital, and now you're trying to build a company. So you've been forging a product, and now you got to forge a company. And I'd actually argue forging a company is much more difficult than forging a product. Basic reason is people are irrational. So you probably all know this. Either your parents, your significant other, your brother or sister, your teacher, somebody in your life is irrational. Building a company is basically taking all the irrational people you know, putting them in one building, and then living with them 12 hours a day at least. So it's very challenging. Now there's techniques for coping with that, and some people get good at it and some people don't, but that's really what operating is about. So basically what you're doing when you build a company is you're building an engine. And at first you have a drawing, literally on a whiteboard, and you're architecting it. And it looks very conceptually clean and beautiful and pretty. But when you start actually translating it to practice, it looks more like this, and you're holding it together with duct tape. And it takes a lot of heroic efforts of people to actually hold it together. That's why people work 80, 100 hours a week, is that heroic efforts is actually necessary to keep this thing together because you don't actually yet have polished metal in place. Eventually, you want to construct a high-performance machine, a machine that actually almost nobody really has to worry about every hour, every minute. And, as we used to joke about eBay, that if Martians took over eBay, it would take like 6 months for the world to notice. That's what you want to get to. Or as Warren Buffett says, build a company that idiots can run because eventually they will. So this is what you want. Basically a performance machine that idiots can run. Now, as a leader, what is your real job? What's your role? Strictly speaking, there's only one book ever written that actually explains how to do this. It's a little old. It's written in 1982 by Andy Grove. It's quite famous and quite successful. And his definition of what your job is to maximize the output of an organization, your organization that you're responsible for. So CEO is everything, and a VP would be part of the organization, and the organizations around you. So if you're a VPE, you actually are responsible for the performance of the product team too, or the marketing team, because you have influence there. So this is how you measure people, and you want to focus on the output, not the input. The old adage about not measuring motion and confusing that with progress, you're measuring only progress. And this is going to sound like a fancy and glamorous thing to do. Maybe people get excited about managing a whole large organization and being responsible for the output. But in practice, what you're going to learn today, hopefully, is that it's more about things like ordering smoothies, teaching your receptionist how to answer the phone properly, and serving as a $10 an hour TaskRabbit for your employees. So let's talk about that. So at first, when you start a company, everything's going to feel like a mess. And it really should. If you have too much process, too much predictability, you're probably not innovating fast enough and creatively enough. So it should
pardon me for a second.
Problem, and what you're doing is fundamentally triaging. So some things will look like a problem and they're actually a cold. They're just going to go away. So somebody's annoyed about this or that. That may be a cold, and you shouldn't stress about it. You certainly shouldn't allocate a lot of your time to it. And some things are going to present themselves as colds, but just like in the emergency room, if they're not diagnosed properly, they actually can become fatal. So what I'm going to try to do is help give you frameworks for thinking about which things are colds and which things are potentially fatal. So one of the most important things I learned at Square is actually a concept of editing. And this is, I think, the best metaphor I've ever seen in like 14 years of running stuff of how to think about your job. It's natural. It's a natural metaphor, so it's easy to take with you every day. And actually, it's easy to transmit to each of your employees so that they can figure out whether they're editing or writing. It's a natural construct. You generally know when someone asks you to do something, am I more writing or am I more editing? So an editor is the best metaphor for your job, and we're going to talk about the specific things you're doing in editing. The first thing an editor does, and you probably all had this experience in school, is you submit a paper to a TA, a draft to your friend. The first thing an editor does is they take out a red pen, or nowadays, online, and they start striking things, basically eliminating things. The most important task to an editor is to simplify, 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 and that usually means omitting things. So that's your job too, is to clarify and simplify for everybody on your team. The more you simplify, the better people will perform. People cannot understand and keep track of a complicated set of initiatives. So you've got to distill it down to 1, 2, or 3 things and use a framework that they can repeat. They can repeat without thinking about. They can repeat to their friends. They can repeat at night. Don't accept the excuse of complexity. A lot of people will tell you that, well, this is too challenging. This is too complicated. Well, yeah, I know other people simplify, but that's not for me. This is a complicated business. They're wrong. You can change the world in 140 characters. You can build the most important companies in history in a very simple to describe concept. You can market products in less than about 50 characters. There's no reason why you can't build your company the same way. So force yourself to simplify every initiative, every product, every marketing, everything you do, and basically take out that red and start eliminating stuff. Second thing is what editors do is they ask you clarifying questions. So when you present a paper to somebody, what do they usually do? They find some ambiguity somewhere, and they say, well, do you really mean this? Do you mean that? Do you have an example of this? That's what your job is. So you're in a meeting, and people are going to look to you. And the real thing you do is you actually ask a lot of questions. And they can be simple, basic questions like, should we try this 7 days a week or 6 days? They can be fundamental questions like, where's our competitive advantage here? We try to do this actually as investors too. Some investors will ask you a billion questions about a billion things, and they'll have you do diligence forever. We try to narrow down to what are the 1, 2, or 3, 4 things that actually matter for this company and only focus on those things. So it allows us to be more decisive, and we can make decisions rapidly. It allows us not to distract you from your day job, which is actually building a company. And yet, I think we still get to the highest fidelity answer because we don't have all these extra extraneous pieces of details and data. Now, it's hard. It's something you have to practice, but when you're good at it, every step you eliminate, Andy Grove estimated that you can improve performance by 30 to 50%. The next thing you do is allocate resources. So the editing construct, this is what editors do all the time. They take editors from the Mideast and covering the Mideast, and they move them to Silicon Valley because Silicon Valley is now more interesting. Or they move them to a sports section because they want to compete on the basis of sports with other journals and other publications. So that can be top-down, where I take a bunch of allocated resources and people and say, we're now going over here, we're going to compete on this basis, and then next month, next quarter, next year, I'm like, well, that Middle East coverage is getting boring and bland, we don't want to do that anymore, let's go chase after something else. Or it can be bottom-up, just like journalists mostly come up with their own stories. The people who work with you generally should be coming up with their own initiatives. So a reporter will generally, who covers Google, come up with the interesting stories that they're hearing in the ether, and propose 1 or 2 to their editor for approval, but it's not like the editor saying, go cover Google, and this is the angle I want. Once in a while they do that, but that's not the meat and potatoes of what a journalist does every day. Your goal over time is to actually use less red ink every day. So one way of measuring how well you're doing and communicating to your colleagues about what's important and what's not, why some things are important, some things are not, is how much red ink you're pulling out every day. And it's okay if you have a bad day and the red ink's all over the place, but it's not okay if the red ink next month is more than it was last month, the next quarter is more than this. So measure yourself of how much red ink you're creating. The other thing that's very important that actually isn't as intuitive to a lot of people is the job of an editor is to ensure a consistent voice. So if any of you read The Economist, you can tell that there's one consistent voice. You can pick up any article, any post in The Economist, and it feels like it was written by the same person. Ideally, your company should feel like on your website, on your PR release, on your packaging if it's a physical product, anywhere on your recruiting pages, should feel like it was written by one person. That's extremely difficult to do. And at first, you're going to be tempted to do that yourself, which is okay for a founder to do that, him or herself initially. Over time, you do not want to be doing all of the consistent voice editing by yourself. You want to train people so they can recognize the differences in voice. So if you see this website page, it looks very different than the recruiting page, you start asking questions, why is that? Is the reporting messed up? Is one of the leaders over here not really understanding the voice of the company? So you have to fix that over time, but you want to start with the objective of everything should feel exactly the same. It's quite difficult in practice. Almost every company has at least one piece of the organization that isn't exactly on the same voice. At Apple, which is under Steve's regime, which was notorious for getting this right, if you ask someone who worked at Apple, ask them about the internal tools about recruiting. Do they really feel like Apple products? All of them will tell you no. So you're never 100%, but you definitely want to get as close to that as you can. The next complicated topic is delegating. So just like the other thing I like about the metaphor of editing is writers do most of the work in the world. Editors are not actually writing most of the content in any publication. So that's actually true of your company. You are not going to do most of the work. You shouldn't be doing most of the work. And the way you get out of doing most of the work is you actually delegate. Now, the problem with delegating is that actually you're responsible for everything. So as CEO, founder, there is no excuse. There's no like, that's that department over there, or this person over there screwed up. You're always responsible for every single thing, especially when things go wrong. So how do you both delegate but not abdicate? It's a pretty tricky challenge, and both.
I might stop it there. You guys can watch more of that. It is pretty interesting, but it gets to be more and more of an abstraction unless you're actually in the process of trying to hire people and manage people. A lot of it is really good advice, but I realize that because you guys aren't in that zone yet, it probably feels like it's a bit far away. But maybe keep it in your back pocket for later. I do like that analogy he uses between media, like actual media, and building a startup, particularly consistent voice. Like, how many times have you interacted with a brand where the touch points you have are disjointed and how that feels really incoherent and like a poor experience? Like, you might sign up for something, say, you read an article and you sign up for an email newsletter, and say the email confirmation comes through and it's just really generic and bland, whereas like the article had a specific tone of voice, and how that ruins the customer experience. Like, just thinking about all of those things has more of an impact than you realize. Cool. So what's the next one? Hiring. Hiring is really hard, regardless of where you are. How many of you guys have actually hired and fired people in the past? Or hired people? Or for the MVP. If you have for the MVP, that's cool.
It's hard because you can't go on sites like Indeed unless you're a registered business. They shut down your account.
Really?
Yeah, I tried to do through Indeed, put an ad up, and then they came back because it has to go and be approved, and then they came back and said that my account had been disabled, and I could dispute the claim upon the app dispute it. I went back and said, what's wrong with the ad? Maybe it wasn't offensive because I was quite anyway. And they just said, we can't find any proof that you're a real business. So unless you can show us like a statement, a bank statement, or a utility bill, or maybe an ASIC registration, then we won't be able to post it because we have, for the safety of others, we have to, those applying, that we have to prove that you're a real business. So Indeed, although free, you have to be business.
Have you got an ABN?
I have an ABN, so I've applied for ASIC because it's only for a year, $30.
Yeah. Okay.
But that's taking a while because it takes phase the process, so I've lost that, but I'll go back.
Mm.
But easy through universities to find students.
Well, that's cool. It's good that you tried. It's a shame that you got rejected.
Yeah. Or joining up in his riders, no indeed.
Yeah, so hiring good people is hard. Hiring them into a startup is really, really hard because generally people don't want to work for companies they've never heard of that may go out of business in the next 3 months that are generally very risky. So that's generally what you're up against. So even when you get people to say yes, like to the application list, like, so, in that example, like you might get some people coming through, even when they come in to realize who you are, it's really hard to get them over the line. Some of the tactics, and I might skip between these two videos and we can watch elements of them. So some of the tactics that I've found to be really helpful are when you're moving outside of like just the core set of founders or just you, and you're trying to hire people. You don't necessarily have to try and hire, like you don't have to hire people with too much experience. It usually doesn't matter too much in a startup environment. But what does matter is potential. When I say potential, is like people who can get shit done. Generally, they will be more likely to perform well in a startup environment that's uncertain and dynamic and pretty crazy than people who are more senior and just want to try out the startup thing. They generally fail in my experience. I've tried to hire a few of them and they're not very good. Or they see stepping out of, say, a more structured job, say a journalist who may be working in a massive media company, may see stepping into, say, a startup as like taking a step back and taking it easy for a while, when that's the reverse is true, like it's actually harder. The one thing that I found really effective for hiring people, which is what you have, the only advantage really that you have over bigger companies when you're hiring, is hiring into the mission. If you've got a mission that's kind of scary and audacious, people want to be a part of that. They're kind of attracted to that. So I failed and then succeeded on both fronts, trying to hire people and then not getting that person to say yes, and then going in on a real like mission base. We're trying to change things in the media kind of technology space, really honing in on the mission and talking about that a lot. And that was more effective in convincing someone, essentially selling them to come and work for me. Because that's what you're doing when you're hiring someone. Generally, if you're hiring someone that's wanting to work at a startup, generally they've probably got other options, right? So you're selling them. You have to sell them on why it's a good idea for them to take the risk of joining a startup that might fail, probably earning less than they could earn elsewhere, even if you give them some options and stock. So that mission kind of and the vision is really important. There's some really good reading in the links below here, and a video that goes with it. So there's a book called The Hard Thing About Hard Things, and it's basically my sort of most recommended book on just managing and building a company. But it's very kind of software centric, but it's really easy to read. It's not like a textbook. It's like stories about management. And this guy, Ben Horowitz, is now a VC in Silicon Valley. He's very well known. If you don't want to read it, you can just watch that video at the bottom. And he talks about a lot of the stuff that he says in the book. And there's a few blog posts within there around this specific topic of how to hire. I might swing between this video here where they talk about this topic and blend it with the next topic, which is
culture and team.
Which is culture, which is sort of the same thing, really. Oh, actually, no. I'll take that back. It's not the same thing. So Brian Chesky founded Airbnb. He calls culture like a shared way of doing things and a shared vision or passion. I've talked a little bit about this over the semester. But culture is really important for the same reason as aligning to the mission is. Unless you create an environment where people actually actively want to work, you're not going to be able to retain them because you're not going to be able to pay them as much as they can earn elsewhere. There's got to be a reason that's non-monetary for them to work with you on something, on your startup. That's where having a mission and aligning to the mission really matters. And generally, if you can build that around your own values, then it's not going to feel like it's fake. Like you can't really pull off. It's sort of like being in a relationship. You can't pretend to love someone. Eventually, it'll break down. So like starting a company and building your values, you can't pretend to run a company a certain way just because you read an article about how Apple did it or how like BuzzFeed did it or whatever. Like unless it's really true to what you want to do, then you're going to fail. And then if you can communicate that effectively, and it's an attractive proposition to people, which hopefully it is, because why would you do it otherwise? You wouldn't want to do it anyway. Then you should be able to attract people who are like-minded, who should stick to you based on your culture. Brad Feld, who's a VC, calls culture, he has a more cynical view of what culture is. And he basically views it as like everybody, if you imagine all the workplaces you've been in, they always talk about culture or they talk about the way things are done. His view is like culture is basically all of the shit that people can't really talk about very much, and they put it into a box and call it culture. Whereas actually, you know, what you should be trying to do is basically just develop a set of cultural norms that describe how you get things done in your business. Because like some companies have cultural values that are like, they write them up on a wall and they mean nothing. You know, it's like you just write them down and then everybody goes back to work and just does what they do normally. And there's lots of interesting techniques. In fact, that guy, Ben Horowitz, has some of the best techniques around enforcing cultural norms and values around your startup. Generally by having sort of a forcing moment. Brian Chesky, who is in this video,
set the stage with a few slides and some comments, but the main stage is going to be with Brian when he comes up and talks about how he built the Airbnb culture. So you're here, I've done this class. Questions are never straightforward. The real question is, what is company culture going to be?
Yeah.
You know, culture that we can generally talk about society.
Yeah, so it's very distinct from, you know, normal culture, like of what actual, you know, it's company culture is what we're actually really describing. So have a listen to this. It's sort of an articulation of like those core fundamental building blocks of building company culture. And then we can double back to listening to how, say, Pinterest, the founder of Pinterest and Stripe, and those guys get that hiring fit, which is really insightful.
About groups, about places or things. Here we're talking about company culture. And so how do one define company culture? We can take the previous definition and modify it a little bit. And so this is a hint of how we may want to define company culture. Every day, blank and blank of each member of the team in pursuit of our company blank. And some people have filled these in with different sort of things. The first blank could be assumptions, beliefs, values. My favorite is core values. The second blank for the B blank, people have said behaviors. My favorite sort of answer to that is real action. How do you act? And in pursuit of goals, that's kind of weak. In pursuit of big and hairy, audacious goals, that's a little stronger. But a better definition is in pursuit of the mission. So now that sort of we have that definition, what do we do with it? And why does it matter? This is a quote from Gandhi: your beliefs become your thoughts become your words become your actions, and your actions become your habits, and your habits becomes your values, and your values become your destiny. If you don't have a good culture in the company, you can't pursue your destiny. What matters is it becomes the first principles that you sort of go back to when you make decisions. It becomes a way to align people on values that matter to the company. It provides a certain level of stability to fall back on, and it provides a level of trust that people can sort of trust each other with. It also gives you a list of things that you should be able to figure out what to do and what not to do. And what the more important thing about that is what not to do. And then finally, the other thing that is important is it allows you to retain the right employees. there are people in this world that are not going to be a fit for your company, but if you have good, strong culture and good, strong core values, you'll know who you want to retain and who you do not want to retain. And if you take the first words, first letter of those, it happens to help you move faster. Another reason, you're thinking that's like all mushy stuff. This is actually more scientific stuff. So here are indices from 1997 to 2003 of stock market index of companies in the S&P 500, in the Russell 3000, and then for the Fortune 100 best companies to work for. They survey all these companies out there, and they picked out companies that they believe are the best companies to work for, and the returns, the stock market returns of those companies happen to be 11.08%, which is almost twice that of the other two indices. And so there's real power in companies that treat their employees well, where there's a lot of trust and where there's a lot of strong culture. So how do you sort of create a set of values and sort of define the culture, et cetera? You get asked that a lot. You got to start with the leader of the company, the founder, and sort of ask yourself, what are the personal values that are most important to you? What are those things that are most important to the business? Who are the types of people you like working with, and what are their values? And through that, you sort of distill together what a set of values are. Then think about all the people that you've never liked working with. What values do they have? Think of that, the opposite of that, and maybe those should be considered values for your company. And finally, remember, the values have to support your mission. And if it doesn't support your mission, you're missing something. And then the last final checks are, they have to be credible and they have to be uniquely tied to your mission. So at Zappos, in terms of uniquely applied to the mission, we were focused on creating a culture that was going to provide great customer service. So the first core value we had was to deliver wow through service. We were very specific that we wanted to deliver great customer service and it was going to be a wow experience. And then below that, we want to sort of add a paragraph supporting that, talking about exactly what we mean by that. We want to support them, deliver wow through service, and support people such as our employees, our customers, and our brand partners, and our investors. In terms of the opposite thing, we generally didn't like working with arrogant people. So one of our core values at Zappos was to be humble. So those are two examples where we sort of created core values in a way that sort of became credible and uniquely tied to our mission. So you go through this process, you come up with a few core values. These might be some of them, whether it's honesty, integrity, service, teamwork, and it might be a list of, you might start with 3, you might end up with a list of 10, you might list of 30. It's a good start. And when Zappos went through this process, we started with we asked all the employees at the time what core values they want to identify with. We came up with 37. We sort of whittled it down to about 10. And it took a year to do this. That's a long time. And you might want to ask why. Well, if you just come up with the word honesty, I mean, give me a break. Everybody wants the culture to be honest. No, nobody's going to say, I want to be lied to every day. Service, what do you mean by service? There's got to be a lot more depth in this than that. And everybody talks about teamwork, but there's a difference in level of teamwork that you see in an intramural sports team versus a baseball team. And so how do you sort of dive deeper into teamwork? What are the things that don't work for a team? A lot of it has to do with communications. A lot of it has to do with things that people have studied. And you might want to go deeper into that. At Zappos, we thought about, well, there are a lot of smart people in this room. When they're fighting with each other and trying to figure out who's right and who's not, it's probably not the best use of time. And we wanted everybody to sort of riff off each other and help each other make any idea better. The result is that the company gets a better idea, not that any individual person is right. So we wanted to instill this idea that it's company first, then your department, then your team, then yourself. And how do you do that? You can go a level deeper in that. There's a great sort of element of high-performing teams that I really like, which is this pyramid that was created by Patrick Lencioni, and he wrote this book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And the reason this is interesting, he talks about the breakdowns of a team. First of all, a lot of teams break down because they don't have any trust. Then, even if you had trust, why do you need trust? Well, then if you have trust, you can actually have debates and conflict and get to the right answer. If you don't have conflict and debate, people are it's the blind leading the blind. How do you know you actually got to the right answer before you sort of commit to something? So people are not actually willing to commit. They're afraid of committing. And so let's say you get to the next level and you are actually able to commit. Well, what goes wrong then? It's usually because people are not held accountable to things that they committed to. And if people are not held accountable to the things that they've committed to, then they can't get results. And I would submit to you, if you think about the company as a black box and results, whether it's financial, whether you produce a great product, or anything like that as the output, one of the major inputs is the culture of the company. So some other best practices we're going to actually talk about during Q&A, because I think this is going to blend into the conversation, is that you want to incorporate your mission to values. We've talked about that. Performance, you got to think harder, deeper, longer about your values than you might initially think you need to do. One of the things that I think a lot of companies don't actually do is they interview for technical fit or skill fit or competency in that realm, but they don't actually interview for the culture fit and whether someone will actually believe and follow the mission. I think that's a big, big no-no. Like, I think you can have the smartest engineer in the world, but if they don't believe in your mission, they're not going to pour their heart and soul into it. And that's one of the things where if you actually sort of start thinking about culture from the interview process to performance reviews to making sure that it's a daily habit, you'll get a lot further with making a great culture. But the final point on making it a daily habit, I think culture, just like customer service or fitness, is like motherhood and apple pie. Everybody wants to provide great customer service. Every company wants to have a great culture. What they fail to do is make it a daily habit. You just can't be fit if you don't do it as a daily habit. Eventually you get out of shape and you get fat. And then you're like, oh, I got to go on a crash diet to sort of get back into shape. That doesn't quite work.
I might stop it there. That's quite a good point, actually, that daily habit thing. And it's quite hard to do. I haven't been able to pull it off yet. We've tried a couple of different things in our company to do it. One of the best examples I heard from Andreessen Horowitz, which is an investor, an investment like a VC fund. One of their core values is they are on the side of the entrepreneur. A lot of VCs are known to be sort of predators and they take advantage. So they want it to be different. And that's one of their values. And like, well, how do they put it into practice in it as like a daily habit? One of the things that their people who work for them, who are the funders, and I'll get into that ecosystem in a second, they have constantly having meetings with founders, with entrepreneurs. They're constantly meeting them. So that one of their rules is, as a daily habit, if they're late to a meeting with a founder, doesn't matter who it is, doesn't matter if they're an investor in their company or not, regardless of who it is, if they're late, then they fine them $10 for every minute that they're late, which is a lot of money. Like, because you might be 10 minutes late to a meeting, so you have to hand it over to the founder in cash, like right then and there, as a way to kind of say, well, we respect you, we respect your time, so we're not going to be late, we're not going to be those assholes with the cash where you have to just, suck up to us. So as one of the daily habit elements, we've tried a few different things, but definitely not perfect, and we're not there in that way yet. What I might do is come back to this one, if we've got time, a bit later, so after culture. And I might go through the funding section, because there's a bit of content to cover here. So generally, most businesses, regardless of the type, they generally will need a little bit of capital at some point. It's quite rare, although it does happen that you can fund a business through cash flow. It's quite difficult in say a media startup where you've got to build one side first. You've got to build an audience and then you get to sell the audience. Generally, there's probably a gap where you're building the audience and you need to get paid. But the audience either isn't big enough or you don't have enough track record to sell advertising into that audience yet. So that's like a cash gap. Generally what you'd then do is say, if you've got that, you might go out to the investor market and say, hey, I've got an audience that's growing. I know we can sell advertising to it in the future. I need some capital so I can keep growing it, and then we can start selling advertising. There's equivalents for all different types of startups. But there are startups that do manage to just do it through cash, or they borrow money off friends and family or whatever, but it's quite rare. If you're interested in this, this is a huge topic, funding. Like, you could go on for hours and days on this stuff. Some of the best is these two links here. The bottom one, First Round, they're both investment firms, VC firms, First Round and Andreessen Horowitz, the A16Z. And they've got advice and interviews and all sorts of stuff in there. It's very American. This is most of this is American, this stuff. I'll give you an overview of what it actually means to raise money. So for you guys, you've started a company, you've incorporated it, you registered it, it's a company, you own all of the shares. Say there's 100 shares in your company. Essentially what you do at that point is, when you raise money, is an exchange. There's two types of raising money. There's equity financing and debt financing. Debt financing, you go to a bank and the bank gives you the money. It's like when you buy a house. They say, yeah, you're going to buy a house. I'll give you the money and we'll charge you interest over time. That's debt. You have to pay us back. Equity funding is what I'm talking about here, which is not debt financing. Equity financing is where you say, I'm going to give you a portion of this asset, the asset being the business, and you get to own it. And in exchange, you're going to give me money to run the business. So you offer a portion of your company up for a set amount of money. And it happens at different rates. So, the portion you have to give up changes depending on, how mature your company is for different stages. But the same principle applies regardless of how big your company is. Regardless, if you're Uber, it's the same thing is happening as whether you're a startup that's raising a seed round. The way it actually sort of pans out is with this diagram here. So for example, the top two boxes are before you've sold any of your company to investors. So at the top, say your total what's called pre-money valuation. Pre-money just meaning I haven't gotten any money from investors yet. And when you go to raise money, generally those terms get thrown around, so you kind of need to know what they mean. At that point, say you say, all right, I think this company's worth $8 million, just total hypothetical. And that's owned by you or the founders, 100% of it, which is a great outcome if you can get that far and it's all owned by you. And you then go in your IN, you don't have to do this for your assignment, but in the examples that I've shared with you, you've seen where we've done it. We said we are offering investors up to 20% of the company at an $8 million pre-money valuation. Essentially what that means is we're offering you 20% of the company and we're going to retain 80% of it. But in exchange, you have to give us $2 million. What that actually then does, like after that happens, after they give you the money, your company looks like this in the bottom boxes. So you've got 20% is owned by your new investors, whoever they are. They might be VC fund, it could be friends and family, it could be high net worth, so angel investors, and I'll go through that in a second. And 80% is owned by you. And that's called a dilution. So you're diluting your ownership by a certain percentage. That then means the total post-money valuation is whatever you were at the start, so 8 million, plus the amount of money you've raised. So in that instance, it was worth 8 million before, you've got $2 million in the bank account, so you're now worth $10 million. So the post-money valuation is $10 million. Does that make sense? The reason why I laboured that is because I've been in moments with investors who are going to give us money and all of this shit gets really confusing and they all get confused about it and everybody's talking about different figures and different numbers and like post and pre-money valuation. They're like, why aren't I getting this percentage when I'm giving you this much money? And it all gets really out of whack. So it's really important that so even though investors were sort of a bit confused, that wouldn't be the case in America. It's more likely to be the case in Australia from high net worths. So funding stages. There's different stages of funding and they occur in what's called rounds of funding. each round has a name or a type, and they typically have a set of parameters for a startup. At the bottom end, you've got like your initial kind of seed funding, pardon me, and that might come from you, friends and family, whoever it is. At that point, you probably don't need to have an IM, you probably don't have anything, you probably don't even have a business at that point. It might just be your money in the bank account. It could be any amount of money. I've just put in $10,000 to $500,000 potentially in that seed round there. And sometimes that might be a loan. They might say, I'll give you the money, and if you can pay me back one day, great. If not, then I helped you achieve your dreams, something like that, which would be lovely. Or you've got your more traditional seed round, which might be between $1 million and $3 million. Generally, the people who are giving you that kind of money are what's called angel investors. So the angel investors are entrepreneurs who might be successful, or people who've made a lot of money, who are interested in your area, your space, obviously interested in making money, but also interested in getting involved in the startup space. So angel investors typically will also be advisors, and they try and connect you to more money down the chain. They'll try and connect you to business opportunities, etc. High net worth individuals, they're basically different to angel investors in that they're just people who've got a lot of money, and they're looking for more interesting investments as a portion of their total capital that they have. A lot of the investors I've had in my startups have been high net worths. Pardon me. People who are worth, anywhere between $10 to $200 million in terms of their personal net worth, and they might be interested in investing in certain things. They might be, in the case of the investors that I've had, they're people who've made money building businesses in the media, and so they know and understand business opportunities in the media, so they invest in startups in the media for that reason. And then there are VC funds out there that do seed investment rounds. So First Round Review is one that does seed rounds. In Australia, there's a couple. Blue Chili is one. A lot of incubators would be sitting in that stage. So there's an incubator at Monash that gives sort of a seed round. Generally, at that point, if you're taking that amount of money, they generally ask for you to give up 20 to 30% of your stock, which is quite a lot of your company. The reason why they do that is because it's very high risk going into a startup that early, so they want to get a larger chunk so that if it is successful into the future, they make it a high return. Basically from there, if you get, usually from that amount of money, you usually prove product market fit. That's generally what you're doing in that seed stage. If you get past that, generally the time period is 12 to 18 months. It would be the runway for that amount of cash. That's the time you've got to set the money on fire and see if you can make it work. If you get past that, every round after that is called a series, and it usually goes in letters. So Series A, Series B, Series C, off it goes, and I'll show you some examples of that in a second. Series A in Australia is between sort of 2 to 5 million. In America, it can be up to 10 to 15. Generally, the people who are making those kinds of investments are VC firms, so venture capital firms, and bigger companies are the ones who have that kind of cash. And then the amount that they will ask for generally is lower. So they generally won't take as much of the company because the risk-reward profile changes. So if you've gotten to a Series A where you've proven enough traction, you can raise that amount of money. Generally, the risk isn't as high because you've got customers and you've got traction. So you can prove that there's a business there. And that percentage stays relatively the same at the $10 to $30 million sort of Series B mark. So one of the guys I was working with in the past, he raised I think it was a 15 million Series B round when he first went to America. And that was sort of the quantum of what they raised. And then anywhere from Series C to E to G to sort of more cash into the future can be anything. It can be huge amounts. Like Uber raised like a $3 billion Series G round from like the Saudi Arabian government for like years ago, which brings into sharp relief the fact that they've only just allowed women to drive. It's pretty ridiculous. Anyway, and generally that's a smaller percentage, a much smaller percentage at that point. along the way there are acquisitions that happen. So companies will acquire other companies at any stage, depending on the type of company they are. But if you're looking for VC funding, that's generally the path. There's a lot of detail behind funding with VCs. I won't get into it, but you can read a lot of the stuff on the pitfalls and the thorns of going with VC capital. So I pulled in some updated funding round details of some media companies that we'll all know about, so you can get a feel for this. This is from Crunchbase. I need to update that. That's been updated, but they haven't raised any more money on after this, so that's still accurate. So Vox Media have raised their Series F. So their last funding round was $200 million from NBC, which is pretty amazing in that time period. So 2008, that I'm assuming was a seed round there. They went in with a Series A funding round, and then within 6 years, they're up to a $200 million, Series F. At that December mark, they were valued at $380 million. So that's the valuation that the company got. BuzzFeed has a similar amount, although those two big injections of capital are quite astonishing, really. So from that, like what we looked at last week, that embryonic, pretty crappy looking pitch deck, which was the pitch deck they were using to get that Series A round, 3.5 million. A similar time period, they went through that same kind of trajectory all the way up. So after 2 years of working that out, they got a Series B at 8 million, Series C at 15.5. So at every point they were diluting. That's why it's really important if you're going to go on this path, and I've made this mistake with my startups, if you're going to go on this path and start raising capital, you need to be in the right position as a founder with the right amount of equity at the start. Otherwise it becomes, like if you think about it, every time the cake gets split up, like every time they cut you, like they might take you 30%, 30%, 20%, 15%, all the way through. Unless you start with a large enough amount, you as a founder probably won't make any money or hardly any money all the way through the journey. So that's why it's really important to get it right at the start between your founders. Business Insider is a similar thing. So they started with a $900,000 seed round. These are all in American dollars, which at that point they had a $6 million valuation, so right down there at the bottom, which means they would have given up somewhere between 15 and 18% of the company, which is pretty good, a pretty good outcome.
The more investors, the more percentage you give up for your company then? Is that what that means?
No, it's just the number of people who throw in that amount.
Oh.
So for example, like we've done a couple of funding rounds. The first funding round that we did, which was a seed round of $650,000 for Fans Unite, we had 2 investors, a company and a high net worth. We then raised sort of a seed round, post-seed round for Cognitives, and we had, I think it was maybe 8 or 9 investors, but that was at 1.5 million on a 10 million valuation. So what actually matters in the context of you raising money is the difference between the amount of money you raise and the valuation you get. And when I say valuation, like valuation is basically what you can convince people your company is worth and the opportunity is worth. Because it's not like a house or it's not like a car. Like you can't shop for startups. Like it doesn't really work like that. They're so different and the market opportunity is so different. It's more about, at that point, particularly at the start, they're investing in you as a founder. Like, can you bring the idea to life? Do you have the energy? Do you have the commitment to do it? When it gets down the chain, it's more about the fundamentals, the technicals, like, what's the business model look like? What's the revenue number? How much profit? All that sort of stuff. Growth rates. And then, yeah, that balance should, as your business performs well, it should go up. It should be better in your favor. The company valuation should be higher relative to the amount of money you're raising. If your company isn't performing well, then you might still be able to raise money, but it's what's called raising money on unfavorable terms, which means the valuation is low relative to the amount of money you're getting. So you have to give up a lot of the company. So for example, if you raise us $5 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but your valuation is $10 million, you have to give up 50% of the company to make that happen, which is a pretty big price to pay. Particularly if you think, well, once I start succeeding, I'm going to go through that kind of funding chain that will keep diluting. It means you own less and less and less. Or you and your founders. And any other investors. So the other investors also care about that. They also think, well, how much am I going to get diluted in the future? I also thought Now This is... Have you guys heard of Now This? It's like a youth-orientated kind of digital media company in America. It's really cool. I found them on here, and they've got, in a pretty rapid time frame, they've raised a pretty solid amount of money, $32 million. These are all media startups. They're not doing anything other than, different to what you guys are doing. Most of them starting a website, or they've got social distribution, or they've got whatever. So and they're using similar tactics. They're building IMs, they're talking to investors, they're trying to build an audience, they're trying to sell advertising. And you can see that they're succeeding in doing that. And then Mike is another example. So they've raised $60 million over that period of time. Generally, when you see that top round, which was 6.5 million, and it's an undisclosed, and doesn't say it's like a Series X, generally that'll mean that that's a funding round that's different to what I've been talking about here, where you sell shares in the company, and for whatever price you get it for, that money goes into the bank account of the company, and then you get to use it to build your audience or pay your staff or do whatever. Sometimes if you see that, it's generally what's called an aftermarket transaction, which basically will mean that someone sold their shares and another investor has come onto the books, but that money doesn't go into the bank account. Generally that will happen when a company's going well. So yeah, there's lots of examples of that around. Cool. Let's have a look at, let's check this. Cool. So these guys are, Mark Andreessen runs, Andreessen is one part of Andreessen Horowitz, and he's like a classic Silicon Valley startup entrepreneur. The middle guy is a guy called Ron Conway, who was the initial seed round investor in Facebook. So he's got I think he did that and it sort of made his career, because it was like the best call ever. And the guy on the right is a guy called Parker Conrad, who founded a company called Zenefits in the States. And they had a really amazing kind of growth and then crash. So he's raised a lot of capital. We'll watch a little bit of this, and then I'll let you guys watch the rest of it if you're interested in it.
So I want to start with a question for Mark and Ron, which is by far the number one question. Would be a lengthy answer. What makes you guys decide to invest in a founder or a company? Either of you. No. Go ahead. You first.
Well, we have a slide on that. We have an app for that.
Mark can start while we try to get your slide up.
Okay. All right. So say the question again.
What makes you decide to invest in a founder?
So what makes us invest in a company is based on a whole bunch of characteristics. I've been doing this since 1994, right before Mark got out of the University of Illinois. So SB Angel and its entities have invested in over 700 companies. So to invest in 700 companies, that means we've physically talked to thousands of entrepreneurs. And there's a whole bunch of things that just go through my head when I meet an entrepreneur. And I'm just going to talk about what some of those are. And literally, while you're talking to me in the first minute, I'm saying, is this person a leader? Is this person rifle focused and obsessed by the product? I'm hoping, because usually the first question I ask is, what inspired you to invent this product? I'm hoping that it's based on a personal problem that founder had, and this product is the solution to that personal problem. Then I'm looking for communication skills, because if you're going to be a leader and hire a team, assuming your product is successful, you've got to be a really good communicator, and you have to be a born leader. Now, some of that you might have to learn those traits of leadership, but you better take charge and be able to be a leader. I'll switch back to the slide, but let's let Mark.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I guess, and there's a lot of detail to this question that we could talk about, and we may be even a little bit different than Ron, where we are different than Ron, that we actually invest across stages. So we invest at the seed stage, venture stage, growth stage, and then we invest in a variety of different business models, consumer, enterprise, and a bunch of other variations. So there are kind of fine-grained answers, that we could get into if there are specific questions. Two general concepts that I would share. So one is the venture capital business is 100% a game of outliers. It's extreme exceptions. Right, so the conventional statistics are, on the order of 4,000 venture fundable companies a year that want to raise venture capital. About 200 of those will get funded by what's considered a top tier VC. About 15 of those will someday get to $100 million in revenue, and those 15 from that year will generate something on the order of 97% of all the returns for the entire category of venture capital in that year. And so venture capital is such an extreme feast or famine business. You're either in one of the 15 or you're not, or you're in one of the 200 or you're not. And so the big thing that you're just looking for, no matter which sort of particular kind of criteria we talk about, they all have the characteristic of you're looking for the extreme outlier. The other thing I'd highlight that we think about a lot internally is we have this concept: invest in strength versus lack of weakness. And at first that sounds obvious, but it's actually fairly subtle. Which is sort of the default way to do venture capital is to kind of check boxes, right? So, really good founder, really good idea, really good, products, really good initial customers. Check, 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 check. Okay, this is reasonable. I'll put money in it. What you find with those sort of checkbox deals, and they get done all the time. What you find is they often don't have something that really makes them really remarkable and special, right? They don't have an extreme strength that makes them an outlier. On the other side of that, the companies that have the really extreme strengths often have serious flaws. And so one of the cautionary lessons of venture capital is if you don't invest on the basis of serious flaws, you don't invest in most of the big winners. And we could go through example after example after example of that. But that would have ruled out almost all the big winners over time. And so at least what we aspire to do is to invest in the startups that have a really, really extreme strength along an important dimension, and then be willing to tolerate some other set of weaknesses.
Ron, we got your slide up.
Okay, I don't want to over dwell on the slide, but when you first meet an investor, you've got to be able to say in one compelling sentence that you should practice like crazy what your product does, so that the investor that you're talking to immediately can picture the product in their own mind. Probably 25% of the entrepreneurs I talk to today still, after the first sentence, I don't know what they do. And as I get older and less patient, I say, back up, I don't even know what you do yet. But so try and get that perfect. And then I want to skip to the second column. You have to be decisive. The only way to make progress is make decisions. Procrastination is the devil in startups. So no matter what you do, you got to keep that ship moving. If it's decisions to hire, decisions to fire, you got to make those quickly. All about building a great team. Once you have a great product, then it's all about execution and building a great team.
Parker, could you talk about your seed round and how that went and what you wish you had done differently as a founder raising money?
Sure. So, actually, I think my seed round, most of the stuff with my current company felt like, from a fundraising perspective, felt like it came together relatively quickly. But actually, one of the experiences that I had, I started a company before this that I was at for about 6 years, and my co-founder and I pitched almost every VC firm in Silicon Valley. I mean, we literally went to like 60 different firms, and they all told us no. And we were constantly trying to figure out, how should we adjust our pitch, and how should we do the slides differently, and how do we tweak the story and that sort of thing. And at one point, there was this sort of key insight that someone gave me when I was pitching, actually someone at Coastal Ventures. This VC said, guys, he was looking for some very particular kind of analysis that we didn't have on hand. And he was like, guys, you don't get it. He was like, if you guys were the Twitter guys, you guys could come in and you could just be like, blah, 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 and like, put whatever up here, and like we would invest in you, but like you guys aren't the Twitter guys, so you need to make this really easy and have like all this stuff ready for us and all this kind of stuff. And I took like the exactly opposite lesson of what he, I think, wanted me to take away from that with, which was like, geez, like I should really just figure out a way to be the Twitter guys. And like that's the way to do this. And so actually, like one of the reasons I started my current company, or one of the things I found very attractive about Zenefits is, as I was thinking about it, it seemed like a business. I was so frustrated from this experience of having tried, for like 2 years to raise money from VCs, and then sort of decided like to hell with it. You can't count on there being capital available to you. And so the business that I started seemed like one that like actually just maybe I could do it without raising money at all. Like there might be a path to kind of, there was enough cash flow, it seemed compelling enough that I could like do that. And it turns out that those are exactly the kinds of businesses that investors love to invest in. And it made it incredibly easy. So I actually think Sam was very kind and said I was an expert at fundraising. The reality is I don't actually even think I'm very good at fundraising. It's probably something I'm like less good at than sort of other parts of my job. But I think if you can build a business that's where everything is like moving in the right direction, if you can like be the Twitter guys, like nothing else matters. And if you can't be the Twitter guys, it's very hard for anything else to make a difference, for things to kind of come together for you.
Why did that VC say be like the Twitter guys when the fail whale dominated the site for 2 years?
Because
Right, anyway.
it worked.
Yeah.
The other point I want to make is bootstrap as long as you possibly can. I met with one of the best founders in tech who's starting a new company, and I said to her, well, when are you going to raise money? I might not. And I go, that is awesome. Never forget the bootstrap.
So I was actually going to close on this, but I'm just going to accelerate it because Parker, I think, just gave you the most important thing you'll ever hear, which is what I was also going to say, which is, so the number one piece of advice that I've ever read and that I tell people on these kinds of topics is always, it's from the comedian Steve Martin, who I think is an absolute genius. Wrote a great book on his startup career, which obviously was very successful. The book's called Born Standing Up, and it's a short little book, and it describes how he became Steve Martin. And the heart of the book is, he says, what's the key to success? He says the key to success is be so good they can't ignore you. Right? And so in a sense, like all this, we're going to have this entire conversation, and I'm sure we'll keep having it about how to raise money, but in a sense, it's all kind of beside the point. Because if you do what Parker's done and you build a business that is going to be a gigantic success, then investors are throwing money at you. And if you come in, with a theory and a plan and no data, and you're just one of, the next 1,000, it's going to be far, far harder to raise money. So that's the positive way to put it, is kind of be so good they can't ignore you. In other words, you're almost always better off making your business better than you are making your pitch better. The other thing, that's the positive way of looking at it. The negative way of looking at it, or the cautionary lesson, is that, and this gets me in trouble every single time I say it, but I'm on a ton of flu medication, so I'm going to go ahead and just let it rip. Raising venture capital is the easiest thing a startup founder is ever going to do. As compared to recruiting, right, as compared to recruiting engineers, in particular, as compared to recruiting engineer number 20, it's far harder than raising venture capital. Selling to enterprise customers is harder. Getting viral growth going on a consumer business is harder. Getting advertising revenue is harder. Almost everything you'll ever do is harder than raising venture capital. And so I think Parker is exactly right. If you get in a situation in which raising the money is hard, it's probably not hard compared to all the other stuff that's about to follow. And it's very important to bear that in mind. It's often said raising money is not actually a success. It's not actually a milestone for a company, and I think that's true, and I think that's the underlying reason. it puts you in a position to be able to do all the other harder things.
Related to that, what do you guys wish founders did differently when raising money? And specifically, Mark, you mentioned this relationship between money and risk and how that applies here, so maybe we could start with that.
Yeah, so the single biggest thing that people are just missing, and I think it's all of our faults, we're all not talking about it enough, but I think the single biggest thing entrepreneurs are missing, both on fundraising and how they run their companies, is the relationship between risk and cash. So the relationship between risk and raising cash, and then the relationship with risk and spending cash. So I've always been a fan of something that Andy Ratcliffe taught me years ago, which he calls it the onion theory of risk, which basically is, you can think about a startup like on day one as having every conceivable kind of risk, right? And you can basically just make a list of the risks. And so you've got, founding team risk. Are the founders going to be able to work together? Do you have the right founders? You're going to have product risk. Can you build a product? You'll have technical risk, right? Which is maybe you need a machine learning breakthrough or something to make it work. Are you going to be able to do that? You'll have, launch risk. Will the launch go well? You'll have, market acceptance risk. You'll have revenue risk. A big risk you get into in a lot of businesses that have a sales force is, can you actually sell the product for enough money to actually pay for the cost of sale? So you have cost of sale risk. If you're a consumer product, you'll have viral growth risk. Well, you get the thing of viral growth. And so a startup at the very beginning is basically just this long list of risks. Right, and then the way that I always think about running a startup is also the way I think about raising money, which is it's a process of peeling away layers of risk as you go, right? And so you raise seed money in order to peel away the first 2 or 3 risks, right? The founding team risk, the product risk, maybe the initial launch risk. You raise the A round to peel away the next level of product risk. Maybe you peel away some recruiting risk because you get your full engineering team built. Maybe you peel away some customer risk because you get your first 5 beta customers, right? And so basically the way to think about it is you're peeling away risk as you go. You're peeling away risk by achieving milestones. And then as you achieve milestones, you're both making progress in your business and you're justifying raising more capital, right? And so you come in and you pitch somebody like us and you say you're raising a B round. The best way to do that with us is you say, okay, I raised a seed round, I achieved these milestones, I eliminated these risks. I raised the A round, I achieved these milestones, I eliminated these risks. Now I'm going to raise a B round, here are my milestones, here are my risks. And then by the time I go to raise a seed round, here's the state that I'll be in. And then you calibrate the amount of money that you raise and spend to the risks that you're pulling out of the business. And I go through all this, in a sense this sounds kind of obvious, but I go through all this because it's a systematic way to think about how the money gets raised and deployed, as compared to so much of what's happening, especially these days, which is just, oh my God, let me go raise as much money as I can, let me go build the fancy offices, let me go hire as many people as I can, and just kind of hope for the best.
I'm going to be tactical. For sure, don't ask people to sign an NDA. We rarely get asked anymore because most founders have figured out that if you ask somebody for an NDA at the front end of the relationship, you're basically saying, I don't trust you. So the relationship between investors and founders involves lots of trust. The biggest mistake that I see by far is not getting things in writing. My advice on the fundraising process is do it as quickly and efficiently as you possibly can. Don't obsess over it. For some reason, founders get their ego involved in fundraising where it's a personal victory. It is the tiniest step on the way, as Mark said, and it's the most fundamental. Hurry up and get it over with. But in the process, when somebody makes a commitment to you, you get in your car and you type an email to them that confirms what they just said to you. Because a lot of investors have very short memories, and they forget that they committed to you that they were going to finance, or they forget what the valuation was, or that they were going to find a co-investor. You can get rid of all that controversy just by putting it in writing, and when they try and get out of it, you just resend the email and say, excuse me. And hopefully they've replied to that email anyway. So get it in writing. In meetings, take notes and follow up on what's important.
I want to talk a little bit more about the tactics here. Just how does the process go? Can people email you guys directly? Do they need to get an introduction? How many meetings does it take for you to make a decision? How do you figure out what the right terms are? When can a founder ask you for a check?
You wanna?
That was like 6 questions.
That's a lot of things.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
It's the process.
Why don't you describe? Because you'll describe seed, and then I'll describe.
Yeah. So SV Angel, invests in seed stage startups. So we like to be the very first investor, We normally invest today in a round that's $1 million to $2 million. It used to only be $1 million. So if we invest $250K, that means there's 5 or 6 other investors in that syndicate. SV Angel has now a staff of 13 people. I do no due diligence anymore. I am not a picker anymore. I just help on major projects for the portfolio companies that are starting to mature. But we have a whole team that processes. We at SV Angel end up investing in one company for every 30 that we look at, and we end up investing in about 1 a week. I think what's interesting is we don't really take anything over the transom. Our network is so huge now that we basically just take leads from our own network. We evaluate the opportunity, which means you have to send in a really great short executive summary. And if we like that, we actually vote, although I'm not in this meeting anymore, but the group actually votes on, do we make a phone call? That's how important time is in this process. And if enough of the team at SV thinks it's interesting, then they appoint a person to make a phone call to that founder, usually somebody on our team who has domain experience. If the phone call goes well, bingo, we want to meet you. If SV Angel asks you for a meeting, we are well on our way to investing. If that meeting goes well, we'll do some background checks, backdoor background checks, get a good feeling about the company, the market that they're going after, and then make the commitment to invest, and then start helping get other value-add investors to be part of the syndicate. Because if we're going to have an equal workload, we want the other investors in this company to be great angel investors as well.
I might stop it there. You guys can watch some more and then go on and talk about the process of raising money. So I can give you a quick insight into like what that actually feels like on the other side. So when we raised both of our those seed rounds, each time it's sort of like selling, selling a product, or a crude analogy would be, it's sort of like going out to a bar and trying to pick up. Like, you just need to have lots and lots of conversations, because like you heard the stats there, they talk to so many people. Like, if you're talking to anyone like this, you just need to talk to lots of them, because they're also having lots of conversations with lots of other potential startups to invest in. And so you basically start with lots of email conversations, and then you whittle it down to people who say, yeah, that sounds interesting, let's meet. And you try and have as many of those conversations at once. The thing that you can't do is like progress. So you say you emailed, or you got a list of 30 potential investors, and you emailed all of them, and then one came back early, and then you got all the way down the path with that investor. You had another meeting, you got a term sheet. It's called a term sheet saying, I'm going to invest $1 million at this valuation. That's a really bad outcome. What you really want is, say, multiple investors from that, say, 30 saying, yeah, let's meet all together. Like, not all together as in the same room, but meet around the same time period and have them go through that journey at the same time. Because the only thing that's going to move a deal forward is competitive tension on your part. The only thing that you've got is an advantage in comparison to investors who have the cash, which you really need, is if it looks like someone else is going to give you the money. That's the only thing that will move a deal forward on your behalf. Otherwise, you don't have any power, and you're basically at their behest. There's all sorts of tactics. You can put all sorts of things in place, but it's essentially, that's the main thing you want to try and do. The other thing I'll say is, he mentioned there about like confirming things with investors and whatever. Like, we've had people who say, we've had over a couple of different investors, more than $1 million committed to us that's been disappeared, and they've taken it off the table a long way down the path. Like, basically, when you're raising money, you haven't raised any money, and you have no options unless the money is in the bank. It's like, people take deals off the table all the time. it's like way worse than any other kind of asset purchase you've ever made, like buying a house or anything like that. It's just the Wild West. So you need to close funding rounds as quickly as possible. Generally, it will take 6 months for you to close a decent funding round from the time when you start conversations to the time when you get the cash in the bank. So you need to be aware of that time period. Sometimes they do close it, like if you've got really good connections, if you've got someone like that as an investor, then it will be faster. I've never had anyone like that as an investor. We've got pretty connected investors in Australia, and it's still taken us 5 months, I think was the time it took us to close the last round. The other thing on that is this: if you get multiple investors in a round, you can take the money in portions from them if they all agree on the valuation. For example, if you say our company's worth $10 million and we're selling 20% of it, you can then take $1 million off one investor at that valuation if they accept it, while you're closing the other investors. So we did that as well. But it then means that they can't give you money at a different valuation. They can't then say, if someone's come in at that amount, they can't. Then another investor can't say, yeah, I'll give you $500,000, but I wanted it at a $6 million valuation or a $10 million. You can't take it then because it will be in contravention of the promises you made to the other investor. Do you guys have any questions about fundraising or raising capital? It's a pretty big topic.
What happens if you fail?
What do you mean?
I mean, if none of your startup is successful and you decide to build the whole idea, just a hobby then, just because of hobby using your money.
Well, yeah, so the question was, what happens if you fail at raising money? It depends on how dire your financial situation is, right?
Not raising money, but you, as having your own startup, and you decide you want to do, I don't know, in my case, I want to do dating call, I get $1 million and my project fails or my startup fails. What happens with the money?
Oh, right. So a couple of different things, so if, it depends on who you are, right? Because if you get, it's not you getting money. If you raise money, you have to be incorporated. The money doesn't go to you. It goes to the incorporated entity that is your startup. You don't own it. You're a director of that company, and you have a duty to grow that company to the best of your ability based on, the Corporations Act has laws in there enshrining you to do that. So assuming that you've exerted all of your effort as a startup founder to do that with the capital you've got, and you get to a point and you think, look, this idea isn't working, but you've got money in the bank. Some startups founders have just gone back to their investors and said, look, it's not working, I think you can take your money back. Most of the time, if they're giving you money, if they're high net worths, they're probably not going to take the money back. Startup investing is so risky. Generally, it's like that money has disappeared and it may or may not come back to me in the form of a more valuable company. It's really, really risky, to the point where you have to get them to sign a sophisticated investor declaration, which I mentioned in a previous lecture. So the founder of Slack did that. He raised a very large amount of money, tried an idea, it failed. He went back to his investors and said, take your money back, and he had a lot left. He had like $5 million left. And they said, look, just go and try something else. And then he tried Slack, and now it's a massive success. Generally, it doesn't work like that. Generally, you try out all of your different, because if you raise money, you'll present a financial plan to the investors to say, this is the amount of money we're going to burn over this period of time. To prove out, like you were saying, in the layers of risk, you'll have assumptions that you need to prove in that time period with that amount of money. So if you raise a seed round, it might be, look, I've proven my value proposition. I need to prove that my go-to-market strategy of X will work, and it'll take me 6 months at this burn. And then if it does work, then the next amount of money I'm going to raise is going to be proving out this or doing the next thing. So generally, what will happen is you'll burn all the money, and you'll win or you lose, and then the company gets wrapped up, or you can raise more money. I've been in that situation where we raised more money and we did it on unfavorable terms. So we had our growth trajectory was going well, and there was a lot of energy behind the company, so we got a really good valuation. We didn't get as much traction. So like that guy Conrad Parker was saying, which is in the Venture Hacks Pitching Hacks ebook. The reason why traction is so important is because if you are like the Twitter guys, or if you do have that growth, then it doesn't matter what you say or who you are. They'll give you the money. We didn't have that amount of traction. We were still able to raise some cash based on the basis of the relationships and also the founding team and the technology we built. But we got it at a pretty poor valuation, so we managed to raise $3 million at a $6 million valuation. Yeah, so that is an option as well. You can, like, generally you're not going to give up if you really want to see it succeed. But there is a point where you probably do need to give up if it gets really bad. Because it's probably better to, pursue another idea. And yeah, it is worth reinforcing the fact that raising money isn't an achievement. It's just a down payment on you saying you can achieve something. So lots of startup founders are like, oh yeah, we raised some cash, which is tempting to say because you're like, it is hard, but it's not an actual achievement in the journey of your company. It's just you being able to have another go at it or have the next step. And it is easier than, it's a lot easier than making, people love your product or selling or, selling advertising or all the stuff that Mike Andreessen said. I do agree with that. I think it's a lot easier to raise capital than it is to create a great business. Cool. I might actually call it there. If you want, you can go back and listen to this this hiring and management lecture, session. These guys are quite interesting entrepreneurs. They're brothers who started Stripe, a payments platform, and they're Irish, two Irish guys, and they were really young when they started it. They were 17 and 19, and it's now a $10 billion global international payments platform that powers a lot of the marketplace businesses, like the ones that are similar to your startup idea. They use Stripe to manage all of the transactions. So like eBay, or not eBay doesn't use them, but CloudPeeps or Fiverr, all those guys, where one person is paying another person for some work. These guys generally are the ones doing all the transactions. So they're really it's worth listening to them because they built that, taking on payments and the financial institutions when you're like 17 and 19 is just the most insane idea, as opposed to like starting Facebook, which is just, kids sharing photos, as opposed to big companies putting all of their financial transactions through your startup. Like it's a pretty substantial thing, but they did it. They're like now the wealthiest Irish people in the world because they're both Irish brothers, but they're like 24 now and they're both billionaires, so which is pretty hilarious. Although they obviously don't dress like it. Cool. All right. Thanks.